I am not sure that I exist, actually. I am all the writers that I have read, all the people that I have met, all the women that I have loved, all the cities I have visited. It's 3 a.m. again. The hour when thoughts become shadows, when certainties dissolve. The lamp on my desk casts strange shapes on the wall, and a terrible question emerges. What if everything we think we are is just an elaborate performance? A character we've been playing for so long. We've forgotten it's a role. Yesterday, I caught myself building walls again, carefully arranging achievements like paintings in a museum of self, polishing memories until they shone just right, creating this perfect image of who I think I am. But in that moment of recognition, everything crumbled. Who is this curator of identity, this architect of self, this voice that speaks when I say I? I'm Alexander Gray, and this is Vertigo, and tonight we're going to venture into dangerous territory. The ego is not master in its own house. Freud wrote these words, and they've haunted me ever since I first encountered them, because they point to a truth we all sense, but desperately try to ignore. You see, I've spent years studying the great minds who touched this truth. Philosophers who went mad, gazing into the abyss of self. Poets who danced with their own dissolution. Mystics who found freedom in falling apart. And I've begun to suspect that everything we think we know about the ego, about this precious I we guard so carefully, might be exactly what keeps us imprisoned. Let me show you what I mean. Think of how desperately we cling to our image of self. Every morning we wake up, continuing a story we've been telling for years. A story of who we are, what we deserve, where we're going. We defend this narrative with such ferocity, as if our life depends on it. The cave you fear to enter holds the treasure you seek. There's a peculiar kind of genius in how the ego builds itself, layer by layer, memory by memory, like a master architect designing the perfect prison. But here's what fascinates me. We're not just the prisoners. We're the architects, the guards, and the walls themselves. I discovered this truth in the most unexpected way. During a moment of what I thought was triumph, standing at the peak of what I believed was success, I felt something crack, not in the world around me, but in the very foundation of who I thought I was. You see, the ego doesn't just build walls. It creates entire labyrinths, corridors of justification, chambers of carefully selected memories, hidden passages of denial. The ancient Greeks understood this when they spoke of Daedalus, the brilliant architect who built the labyrinth to contain the Minotaur. They weren't just telling a story about a maze. They were speaking about consciousness itself. But here's what keeps me awake at night: the labyrinth we've built. This maze of achievements and memories. What if it isn't protecting us from some monster, but from our own vastness? What if the Minotaur, this creature we fear in the darkness, is actually the wild truth of who we are? I keep coming back to this thought night after night, pacing in my study when sleep won't come. What if our greatest fear isn't that we're nothing, but that we're everything? Sometimes I'm not sure which is more terrifying. Consider how meticulously we construct this maze, layer by layer. First, through the eyes of our parents, their dreams becoming our compass, their fears our boundaries. Then through education, each achievement a new corridor, each failure a locked door. Then society takes over the construction. Social media becomes a hall of mirrors. Career becomes a spiraling staircase always leading upward. Relationships become rooms we're afraid to fully enter, or afraid to leave. Kierkegaard saw this, how we build our identity through choices, each decision not just about what we do, but who we become. He called it anxiety of possibility, the vertigo of realizing that each choice kills all other possible versions of ourselves. And here's something even more unsettling. The ego doesn't just build this labyrinth. It's constantly renovating it, rewriting history, polishing some memories until they shine, burying others in deep dungeons of forgetting. all to maintain the story of who we think we are. Not until we are lost do we begin to understand ourselves. Henry David Thoreau. I remember the exact moment my walls began to crack. It wasn't during meditation or some profound spiritual experience. It was during an ordinary conversation. Someone asked me a simple question. Who are you when you're not trying to be anyone? The words hung in the air like smoke, and in that silence, that terrible, beautiful silence, I felt every wall I'd built begin to tremble. Every story I told myself start to unravel. The question hit me like a blade between the ribs, because in that moment, I realized I had no answer, only echoes of what others had told me, reflections of what society expected, fragments of roles I'd learned to play. I need to stop for a moment, because even now, telling you this, I can feel that same vertigo, that same groundlessness. Sometimes I wonder if I'll ever find solid ground again, if I even should. All my accomplishments, my carefully crafted personality, my beliefs about who I was, suddenly felt like elaborate props in a theater, and I couldn't tell anymore if I was the actor, the audience, or the empty stage itself. This is the terrifying beauty of ego dissolution. The moment when the architect realizes the entire structure might be an illusion. Nietzsche touched this truth when he wrote, "What we have never loved and known, what has never troubled our souls, we can never lose." Think about that for a moment. Every attachment, every achievement, every piece of identity we cling to, they're not proof of who we are. They're the very things preventing us from discovering what lies beneath. And this brings us to the heart of our struggle with the ego. The ego is not master in its own house. This struggle with the ego isn't new. The ancient Vedic sages called it ahamkara, the I maker. No, that's not quite right. Let me try again. It's more like, God, why is it so hard to capture this in words? Every time I think I understand it, it slips away. Perhaps it's simpler than I'm making it. They saw something fundamental, that there's a part of consciousness that claims ownership, that says, I did this, I thought that, I am this. Like a child signing their name on everything they touch. Think of it like a spider, endlessly weaving its web of identity. Each strand a memory, a belief, a fear, a desire. The web is beautiful, intricate, but the spider has forgotten that it created the web. And now believes the web is all there is. But here's what they understood that we've forgotten. The ego isn't our enemy. It's more like a necessary fiction, a dream the universe dreams to experience itself. Think of it this way. When you're caught in a dream at night, the dream feels utterly real. You believe you are the character in that dream, until you wake up and realize you were both the dreamer and the dream itself. Jung saw this too, but he took it further. He realized that our ego, this precious I we guard so carefully, is really just the tip of an infinite iceberg, a small island of consciousness in an ocean of the unknown. What terrifies us, what really keeps us clinging to our walls, isn't the fear that we're not enough, but the vertigo that comes with realizing we might be everything. This is where Western and Eastern wisdom converge, where Freud's unconscious meets the Buddhist void, where the Greek labyrinth opens into infinite space. The ego builds walls because infinity is terrifying. It tells stories because the truth is too vast to comprehend, like a child drawing lines in the sand to make the ocean feel smaller. Heidegger touched this truth when he spoke of thrownness, how we find ourselves cast into existence, into a world we didn't choose, into a body we didn't select. And in our terror at this fundamental groundlessness, we start building, constructing meaning, creating identity. The Buddhists saw it too, but they went further. They spoke of sunyata, emptiness, not as a void to be feared, but as the very space that allows all possibilities. Like the emptiness of a cup is what makes it useful. The emptiness at our core might be our greatest gift. While the Buddhists saw emptiness as fertile ground for all possibility, Sartre approached this same truth from another angle. He saw that consciousness itself is nothingness, a pure negation, a hole in the fabric of being. Both perspectives pointing to the same mystery, that our solidity is an illusion. But perhaps the most profound insight comes from the Zen tradition. They speak of the no-mind, not as the absence of thought, but as the space in which all thoughts arise, like the sky that holds both clouds and clear weather, never touched by either. And yet, here's the paradox that changes everything. The real voyage of discovery consists not in seeking new landscapes, but in having new eyes. The paradox is this: the ego's greatest trick isn't convincing us that it exists, but convincing us that we need protection from who we really are. We think mastering the ego means building a better version of ourselves, a stronger identity, a more polished self-image. But that's just building a more elegant prison. That moment when my walls cracked, when I couldn't answer who I was, it felt like falling. But here's the strange gift hidden in that terror. When you're falling through empty space, you finally learn something. You learn that empty space is where dancing becomes possible. The question isn't how to master the ego, but how to play with it, how to dance with our own shadows. Because true mastery, if it exists at all, lies in this dance. It's not about destroying the ego, or transcending it, or even improving it. It's about understanding its nature, dancing with it, playing with it, like a child who builds sandcastles knowing the tide will come. You might feel it sometimes, in those quiet moments before dawn, when the stories fall away, when the walls become transparent. That's not emptiness you're touching, it's freedom. It's not meaninglessness, it's possibility. I've spent years trying to master myself, to become someone better, stronger, more complete, until I realized that very effort was the core of my imprisonment. Now I'm learning a different art, the art of wearing the ego lightly, of building identity without believing in it completely, of playing the game while knowing it's a game. It begins in small moments, when you catch yourself defending a story. Pause, when you feel the walls rising. Breathe, when the minotaur of your true nature growls. Listen. These aren't techniques to master yourself. They're invitations to a different kind of dance. Because here's what all the great minds point to. From Lao Tzu to Nietzsche. From the Buddha to the quantum physicists. The self is not a fortress to be defended, but a dance to be danced. And perhaps, in those moments when we stop trying to master anything, when we allow ourselves to be both the labyrinth and the wanderer, the dream and the dreamer, the silence and the song, we touch something true, something that can't be captured in words or contained in concepts, something that's been here all along, waiting patiently, behind every wall we've built, every story we've told, every identity we've tried to become. And so we return to the simplest truth. The question was never about mastering the ego. It was always about learning to play, to build our sandcastles with joy, knowing they'll dissolve in the tide of time. And maybe, just maybe, that's the only mastery we ever needed. Every morning now, I stand before the mirror, not to perfect the image, but to watch it dissolve, to see through the curator, the architect, the storyteller, into something both more empty and more full than any story could contain. There's an old Zen saying that's always stayed with me. Before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. I used to think this was about acceptance, about humility. Now I see it's about something far more profound. The ego will always be there, weaving its stories, creating its patterns, just as waves will always rise and fall on the ocean. But once you've glimpsed what lies beneath, once you've felt the vertigo of infinite possibility, you can return to the game of self with new eyes. You can build your walls knowing they're temporary. Tell your stories, knowing they're dreams. Play your roles, knowing they're masks. And in that knowing, there's a kind of freedom, not from the ego, but from the desperate need to believe in it completely. Remember that Borges quote we started with, about not being sure of his own existence, about being all the books he'd read, all the people he'd met, all the places he'd been. Perhaps that's not just poetry, but the deepest truth about who we are. Not a solid, unchanging self, but a living, breathing conversation between infinity and form, between emptiness and expression, between the labyrinth and the void. I'm Alexander Gray, and this has been Vertigo. And remember, the walls you've built, the identity you guard, the self you think you are. They're not obstacles to overcome, they're invitations to dance.